Woo! Hello and welcome to another Retropower Uncut. I think after the massive high of the Stratos on the rollers last week, it's back down to earth and back to the grindstone in the workshop. We're going to start with Utah. Now I was hoping we were going to have two running car videos one week after the other and actually get this one running in this week's video, and I'm literally in the very last kind of pre-flight checks, as I call it, before we crank it, get some oil pressure and start to fire it up. But we've just run out of time to do it before the video, so hopefully if it all goes well that'll be in next week's video. So on this we've been working on some of the wiring. So Bremax did the main wiring looms throughout the car for us, but there are still some sub looms, as I call them, to do. So where we've got wiring to go on from a switch panel to a multi-plug, or from the instruments to a multi-plug, that sort of thing. We've been working on doing those little sub harnesses so that we could have all the controls ready and the instruments ready for the first fire up. And with that lot done, yesterday I powered up the PDUs for the first time, basically powered up the electrical systems on the car for the first time. And obviously with the PDU based electronics, you can literally see, all the inputs, the voltages, the currents, all the outputs working on the software. So it's a really nice way of being able to sort of fault find and diagnose things. That all went really well. It's running a pair of ECU Master PMU16s, so we've got 32 channels total, I think all of which are used actually on this. So yeah, that's all gone pretty well. Also looking at the back of the car, rather excitably, earlier today, the chap from Autodesk came over with the final rear overriders. Now, as you remember, probably an episode or two ago, they did some scanning on the back. We'd modelled the overrider shape in foam. They then went away, drew them in CAD, did a mock-up one machined in aluminium, and trial fitted that. We were happy with that, so they've now machined the final ones in brass. And I've trial fitted those, happy with those. So tomorrow they'll be going off to Derby plating to be chromed. We're just squeezing them in with the rest of the last batch of chrome, so all the other bits on the car that are still not here are being chromed at the moment. They're literally working on that now, so I would say all of that will be back within the next 2 weeks. So that's pretty exciting. And then yeah, we've just put fuel in it today, pressurised up the fuel system. I've just been setting the throttle, wide open throttle and closed throttle positions in the ECU software. We've just trialled the cooling fan. Adam's literally just taking the spark plugs out now, and the next thing, as soon as I finish filming this, I'm going to be cranking the engine, seeing if we can get some oil pressure. If that goes well, I'm going to stick number one plug in, crank it, get the crank signal oscilloscope up, which should then tell me from the information on there. You'll see a spike where the additional load of that number one cylinder coming up on compression is, which will be able to show me the crank offset between the trigger point on the trigger wheel and that top dead center point on cylinder one, so I can check that the crank offset is correct, get that number in there, and then I think we should be pretty good to fire that up. So extremely exciting. Hopefully be back reporting back on that one next week. Chevette, while we're here, we are in the latter stages of paint on the Chevette, and so obviously we're now trying to get everything ready, so as soon as the shell is painted it can be rolling as soon as possible. So we've just finished all the final build up on the axle. Obviously we had that casing powder coated not too long ago, and we've just done the final build up, final fit of the brake lines, brakes are on there. Ditto the front cross member, John's been working on that. We've got all of the powder coated parts together, all of the sort of steel components we've had zinc nickel plated. Everything was essentially ready to just put that together, so that's just gone together. We had the Quaife sequential box out, we put the gear sensor into that. That actually then meant we had to machine a little bit out of the bell housing, to our surprise here. So we've just machined a little pocket in the bell housing to clear the back of that potentiometer on the gearbox. We've done some measuring up for the clutch slave. It's got a hydraulic concentric clutch slave from Titan on it. So we just need to measure up the protrusion of that into the bell housing versus where the clutch sits to make sure that the cylinder actually sits correctly versus the clutch itself. I would deduce that the 90mm spacer that came with it is not quite big enough. We need a 30mm one, so Titan are sending out a 30mm cylinder for spacer for us for that. With that done, engine and box can go together, and then we'll be putting that whole assembly onto the cross member. because that will all be going into the car from underneath as one. So that's all coming together nicely, and the idea there is we need to get it rolling pretty quickly, because on the 26th I think it is, and it's currently the 10th I think, we are going to be sending the whole car to Simpson to do the exhaust system and manifold on this, and obviously the car needs to be rolling with axles and engine and transmission in for that. So that's where we're at with that. The Manta, which is behind the camera at the moment, Clive's been doing some more work on that, done a little bit more on the fuel system. The owner of that wanted a shut-off valve between the tank and the pump, so the final bit of fuel plumbing from the tank to the pump. He's just been making up a line for that, mounting the fuel shut-off valve and getting all that finalised. And then he's moved on to the oil cooler mounting. We did the holes to mount that when we were doing the metalwork on the car. We needed to put some additional brackets in to brace the top of the cooler. And then it's just going to be a case of making up the lines and mounting the remote filter head at the front, which we'd already made provision for earlier. So we're pretty close to buttoning up the fuel system and the oil system on that now. James, I think we probably showed this last week. James was just finishing off the exhaust system because we got the tailpipe through that the owner wanted, which was like a 3" by 2" / cut inward rolled tailpipe, which allowed us to finish off the exhaust system. So I think we're done with that. Moving on from that, if you follow me this way, this I will pause at. Because people always say, what are the covered up cars? Well, the cars that we're sort of awaiting to get back onto, this one we are basically in a position to crack back on with now. It's a Mark 1 Golf convertible or clipper. We've done all the metal work and paint work on it previously. It's rolling, and we basically got to the point of doing the engine. Now the plan on this has always been VW 1.8T, but converted to being supercharged. So John this week has started, he stripped all the external ancillaries off our used engine. Next week hopefully that will be offered up into the engine bay, so we can start working out the positioning of the supercharger and the layout in the engine bay. And then that will be coming out for a complete rebuild at that point, which we'll be doing here, so we'll cover that in a future video. So we're coming to here. I was hoping there'd be Rich busying himself somewhere with some of the work he's doing, but the place looks a bit of a state at the minute, and the reason for that is that we're doing a load of changes in the workshop. So you'll probably notice in a minute that the wall over here is partially removed, and that ties in with a number of changes that are going on with a bit of a workshop move around. There's an additional part of this building which hasn't been rented by us until this point, but very shortly we're getting access to another part of the building, and we're extending our assembly shop that I've just come through from into that new part, having some new ramps put into there, and then as kind of to tie in a load of disruption in one go, we're doing some other improvements that have been on the cards for a while, one of which is to move the paint booth from in the metal workshop, which is obviously a daft place for it, but when we started out this was our only workshop, through into the paint shop. Now we're going to get rid of this paint booth and we're having a new one put in the paint shop, but then because of the extension of everything we're having to improve some of the services, so we're putting all new air mains in, we're moving the compressor to a different location to keep the runs of pipes more sensible to the different areas of the workshop. We're also putting a new oil-fired heater in, and the new paint booth, because we have an oil-fired heater, the new paint booth is oil-fired, so we're doing an oil installation. And as with everything, we're doing it all ourselves, so you will probably see over the coming weeks various changes in the workshop, so I'll look forward to showing you those. Back to cars. Scott's been working on the Land Cruiser, so most of his work for the last week has been relating to the aircon system. So on this we're using a Vintage Air Gen 4 system, which it's a reasonably bulky unit, but there is a good amount of space on this. The reason we want to go for one of those rather than the smaller Vintage Air systems is that this one, the larger unit, has a flapper valve that chooses between the aircon evaporator and the heater matrix, which means your change of temperature is very instant, whereas the other ones it's always blowing through both, and it relies on the water valve opening and heating up the heater matrix and the evaporator gradually cooling down, or vice versa, which can create quite a delay in the temperature change. So it's always preferable to have one of these bigger units in, and on this we realised that there's a fair amount of space behind the dash. There's a recess behind the engine which we've actually moved forward to give more space for that, because it wasn't necessary with the engine we're using. And that's given us plenty of room to get that unit up into there. And then the plan has always been to duct that to the original fresh air intake. Now on the sort of front wing, there's a set of louvers at the back of the front wing there, and that actually originally goes straight into a heater blower motor box, which then blows through the bulkhead into the original heater units. So we decided, well, that's actually a really nice way of doing it, and it keeps the fan in the engine bay, which means that there's less space taken up behind the dash. So we basically fabricated an aluminium manifold. It's a two-piece manifold that Scott's made, half of which goes onto the vintage air unit, half of which goes onto the bulkhead, and then there's a round tube that joins the two, which ducts the air intake to that vintage air unit from the engine bay. And then we're going to use probably a replica of the original heater box, but with a modern fan inside it, in the original place, still intaking through that original louver setup. So it's going to be quite a neat setup, and it still intakes in the original way. So really happy with that. And we've managed to get the heater unit quite high, so there's probably that much hanging down below the dash. But the plan is we're going to do a panel running across there that's slightly recessed and probably black, upholstered black, so it's quite discreet, to just cover that lower part of the dash. Because what we wanted was to keep all of that heater and aircon unit hidden away, which is something that I think lets down a lot of, well, it lets down the original a bit, but I appreciate the original wasn't about aesthetics, but a lot of the modified ones I've seen have a pretty ugly heater and aircon installation. So we're hoping to improve on those. The next thing he's moved on to is the batteries. We want to get the batteries out of the engine bay, partially for space, partially for cosmetics. So we're sticking with two batteries actually on this, but rather the original system was 24 volt with the two batteries linked in parallel. We're going to link them in series. I think I've got that the right way around. I'm sure I'll be corrected if I haven't. So it'll still be 12 volt, but running two batteries, because we want to locate them behind the wheels at the back here. And there's a bit of a limit on how big a battery we can get in there, and we want to have a lot of battery capacity, so we're going to run two smaller batteries, these 075 batteries here, and Scott's just in the process of fabricating the recesses that they'll sit into. So there's basically going to be a fabricated box which sits under this original area behind the wheel. The battery will sit down into that, and then it'll be there'll be a lid on the top here to access the batteries, and there'll be one both sides. So we'll hopefully catch up with him where he's got to on that next week. Follow me this way. Tom has been doing some very nice metal shaping on the rear valance. I think last week he'd already made a start on this, but he's pretty much got there now. A lot of work involved, a lot of English wheel work. He's now done the recess here, which was one of the sort of critical changes. But the whole shape is kind of slimmer, tucked up, and extends further underneath. And it's absolutely what I hoped it would be. And the transformation, I think, is a significant one for a relatively small amount of change. It really makes the back end look a lot sleeker. And then obviously this cutout here, we're going to have exhausts. It's slightly tapered up, and we're going to have twin exhausts coming back with a slight upward taper, and then a sort of slash cut on the back here. I don't know exactly where they'll come to, but they'll stick out a reasonable amount. They want a reasonably aggressive look to the exhausts, but hopefully still maintaining a classic edge to it. So that's the bulk of what Tom's been on with. Today he's just been fabricating the battery mounts. Actually, it's all about battery mounting this week, it seems. Using a big Bosch battery in the back of this. There's loads of room in the back here, so he's just been fabricating a battery tray to sit to one side here to mount the battery just at the side of the boot aperture here, and then that'll be panelled in. There'll be a panel at the front where the fuel tank sits in front. That leaves us this space here on the left for whatever we want, potentially a subwoofer, but I've not 100% decided on that yet. There will be a subwoofer somewhere in the car. We might just do some slim active subs in the rear footwells, but I'm still kind of in the decision making on the audio system at the minute, but we will be making provision for all the audio system during the metalwork phase. So moving along, Stu has been on the Morris. So obviously last week this came back from having the exhaust system fabricated. Stu's mostly been on with the bonnet. So we initially had a sort of mock-up basic set of metal hinges that we fabricated for the front opening bonnet. But we wanted to improve the feel of that bonnet opening and also bring the bonnet a little bit further forward because it was getting perilously tight on the little spotlights that sat down here. So Stu's now designed a really cool sort of scissor type hinge on both sides, and then we've accompanied that with some little gas struts that actually act directly on the hinge, so it kind of gives it a nice bit of assistance when you open it, and it comes really nicely sort of forwards and down as it opens. So that's looking really good. And then he sort of moved on to doing some cross bracing in the bonnet. These are notoriously sort of flimsy, these bonnets. There's a bracing structure which originally goes up to the original external hinges, but obviously we've lost those, so we can't use that. So we've already put one cross brace in here. We've now put another one further back. But it's always a battle with these because this rear section here is all just single skin. In fact, the vast majority of the bonnet is just single skin, but it's more obvious here because there's not even a return edge. It's literally just a single skin with a cut edge on it, and there's no return lip or anything like that on it. So we're just trying to do some changes to the bonnet to stiffen it all up and make sure, because we were battling a bit with it, its tendency to sort of flex apart meant that when we were trying to judge the fitment and get the gaps right to the wings, it completely changed depending on how much force you were putting on the bonnet when you pulled it up. So it was trying to brace it all so that it doesn't just wobble in and out at the sides. But that's pretty much getting there. I think Stu now has moved on to the door modifications. The owner of this wanted the doors to incorporate what is normally a separate panel that sits underneath. It's a bit of an odd design, but essentially the door normally stops at that swage line right at the bottom there, and then there's a separate panel that infills underneath it. So the owner wanted the door extending down, so effectively that panel becomes part of the door. So that's what Stu's working on at the moment. Look forward to seeing that take shape over the next week. And then Gaz and Steve are working on the Chevette. So it's literally the home straight now. So they're just doing the final sanding on that epoxy on the outside. The inside's painted, I think it was last week though. And the engine bay prep's all done. So I would imagine next week that shell will be completely painted. And then we can move on with fitting all the bits you saw at the beginning of the video. So really excited to see that rolling. I need to in fact order the tyres for that, and we need to get the wheels painted so that we can get it completely buttoned up, axles in, rolling, engine in, gearbox in, and get it ready to go off to Simpson later this month. And I think at that point we shall leave it. So we'll see you next time. Bye.